In an interview from Musician Magazine 1979, Zappa explained that the stuff that I'm working with now is 7-part harmony with no notes doubled, and most of the orchestra stuff is based on that. In other words, if you take any kind of a diatonic scale, it contains 7 notes, and there are ways of spacing those 7 notes so that at all times you're playing the entire scale. If you take a C major scale, it sounds like this. You have a certain number of mathematical possibilities of how you space those things out to get a chord. This chord is made up of all the notes in that scale. That's spread out over an octave and a fifth. It's spelled E, F, A, C, D, G, B. The other thing I worked out is chords built in fifths. You build fifths plus 1/3, and that will also give you 7 notes. Here's an example. That's C, E, B, F sharp, G, D, A. Suppose you want to build a section in a composition that has a certain number of mathematical fixed points. For instance, you say, this section will contain only chords that are made of 5 notes. Each chord must contain these intervals, a third, a half step, a fourth, and a major seventh. Then you set about randomly constructing. First, you write a line, then you harmonize the line with 5-note chords that adhere to that formula. When analyzing these chordal structures, it is useful to measure the distance between each note and the chord by semitones. The analysts can then go about finding chords in the score and applying interval numbers to those of interest. After a while, you find the same structures, both diatonic and non-diatonic, used across a number of pieces. As mentioned in my video on intervallic sequencing, Zappa was interested in the spacing of intervals in the melodic forms, but as we see in this video, he was equally occupied with it in the harmonic forms too.
If you're writing for a group of instruments, and each person in that group gets to play 1 note of a chord, that gives you the chance to make the chord any density that you like. You know, it can be like this, it can be like that, it can be spread out like that. And you can only do that by working with many instruments and different tone colors. And so that's what I've come to appreciate, especially in the writing of Varese, is the tone colors and the voicings of the chords.
This type of harmony could manifest as either a concatenation of one fixed intervallic structure, two alternating structures, or a seemingly random series of structures. The technique can be examined in compositions from the early stages of Zappa's career in the 1960s, although closer examination of selected compositions throughout the 1970s reveals that the technique became a mainstay for Zappa, and that it developed over the years, culminating in the Chord Bible. The Chord Bible was a catalogue of sorts put together by Zappa that contained his favourite chord voicings for use in his orchestral music. Music theorist Brett Clement has conducted research in this area, and his article, An Introduction to Frank Zappa's Chord Bible, is an interesting read. In fact, it is possible that the Chord Bible evolved from simpler intervallic forms of just 2 or 3 intervals moving in parallel motion. In 1968, some of Zappa's orchestral pieces were performed by the BBC Symphony Orchestra for a concert that took place at the Royal Festival Hall in London. The concert was a combination of orchestra and rock music with theatrics provided by members of the Mothers of Invention, but it was also a test pilot for music and narratives that would later appear in 200 Motels. One of the pieces from the event, The Rejected Mexican Pope Leaves the Stage, has fixed pitch intervals arranged successively within a sequence. In the piano, a short sequence unfolds with pitch interval 14 in bars 45 to 46, pitch interval 7 in bar 47, and pitch interval 8 in bar 48. The piece from which the sequence is extracted later manifested in Dance of the Just Plain Folks from 200 Motels, wherein more instantiations of the technique with slightly larger structures occur. In bar 100, the harpsichord and pizzicato strings maintain a fixed intervallic relationship of pitch intervals 1 and 4. In the flute, oboe, and electric piano at bar 156, intervals are fixed at pitch intervals 11 and 3. Another type of harmonic form is whereby smaller sequences are characterized by different structures. As we have already seen, this happens in The Rejected Mexican Pope Leaves the Stage, but is dyadic throughout, whereas in The Pleated Gazelle, cardinalities change with 6, 2, and 4-note structures. The crotchet note septuplet, beginning at bar 206, contains pitch intervals 13, 8, 5, 2, 11, followed by a quaver note non-uplet where the two melodic lines are separated by pitch interval 1, and then in bar 209 pitch intervals 10, 2, 4. The procedure of writing a melodic line tracked by another fixed at a distance of whatever interval had greater implications for Zappa, as the technique was also applied to some of the non-orchestral pieces. For example, in Echidna's R from Roxy and Elsewhere, the melody in the first instance is performed on the clavinet. The melody is then repeated with a trombone, but with an overdubbed clavinet playing the melody harmonized at pitch interval 8. A further example is from the Zappa in New York 1991 CD version of Pound for a Brown. Zappa incorporates close intervallic tracking at the stop points, where all instruments apart from the keyboards drop out. At this point, both keyboard instruments play the melody a semitone apart. During the middle section, the melody in the keyboards is harmonized by a distance of pitch interval 4. In Interlude from Fembot in a Wet T-shirt Contest from Joe's Garage, a melodic line is tracked by 2 harmony notes throughout the entire sequence. This actually represents one of the most extensive uses of fixed intervallic successions in the non-orchestral pieces. Only 4 out of 20 bars in which this structure unfolds is shown here. In 1977, when Zappa began working on Moe and Herb's Vacation, the practice was still being implemented, except that the intervallic structures were considerably larger. The reason for this is that by 1977, Zappa had begun to formalize chords into a catalogue of favored structures that could be used at will. Although hitherto there had been some systemization in the application of intervallic structures, from 1977 onwards they were used more often and more consistently, either as embellishments or as more extensive support for longer melodic lines. By the time Zappa had composed The Perfect Stranger in 1982, the approach took on greater significance and was integrated far more extensively. The technique is also more assured and fluid in The Perfect Stranger. Although Zappa devised his own method of constructing harmonic forms, it was not always reflected in chord successions. The use of predetermined structures was a systematic approach to a musical problem, but the manner in which the structures were employed within the music was not necessarily as methodical. As discussed, the only formula in terms of successive structures is a series of repeating fixed intervallic or alternating ones, and is therefore the only area where the analyst can observe the application of any formula. Analyzing non-repeating structures is a challenge for the analyst. What determines the choice within a homorhythmic harmonization? Are some tenser than others? If so, are there any strategic points at which they're placed to create tension release? This doesn't seem to be the case. These structures appear to follow no specific order. However, by placing these predetermined structures side by side, there were operations of chance in the voice leading. This was something Zappa acknowledged in the 1983 London Symphony Orchestra program notes, where he explains that these structures, or at least successions of these structures, would actually produce unusual voice leading. But still, understanding the choice of non-repeating structures is difficult to ascertain. In fact, it's probable that in some, if not most cases, they were randomized. Zappa copyist David Ocker corroborates this. I never analyzed the chords myself beyond the time I typed them into the synclavier, but they didn't seem to have any particular order. Frank obviously could pick orders of chords so they made sense. It's just possible that if you wrote a program to play an endless random progression of those chords, with or without transpositions, they might just always sound fine no matter what the ordering. Constructing the type of harmonic forms discussed in this video, whether small or large structures, diatonic or non-diatonic, allows Zappa to designate any type of intervallic permutation, whether it was within close regional proximity or across a wide pitch space. These self-devised harmonic forms seem to be one of the ways Zappa was able to establish more control and continuity in his music.